I want to start out, of course, by expressing my appreciation. Congratulations on putting this together, and thank you for inviting me. I'm just delighted to be here. And of course, I can't see our attendees that are far away, but I thank those of you that are here in person, and I also thank those of you that are far away. In this presentation, as you read in the description, and you also, and you're going to see, we're dealing with two topics: mixed classes and project-based learning, which I'm going to abbreviate as PBL. And they're both really complicated topics, but it turns out that they go really well together. When Professor Tinyu told me, we want you to do both of them, I thought, how do I do this together? And then it occurred to me that it's the right decision because these topics really go very well together and they solve some very difficult problems when they're together. All right, so let's start out with definitions very quickly. What are mixed classes? Well, classes that have HL and L2 learners together. And why did that matter? Well, because all language departments have them. They are the most challenging classes to teach, and you'll see why in a second, and because there is no fully developed methodology. And so they matter a lot. We just don't know how to teach these classes very well. Because we've been teaching non-mixed classes forever. We've been teaching L2 classes forever. So that's been developed, but not the methodology for mixed classes. And yet all language programs that have heritage language learners have mixed classes. We know from research I did with Olga Kagan at the National Heritage Language Institute that there are two types of programs that enroll HL learners. We have what are called single track programs where it's all mixed classes. You just bunch them all together. And you also have dual track programs where you have an L2 track and an HL track, and you tend to separate them, or you do separate them for a while, but eventually the two tracks meet. And at the point where the tracks meet, then you've got mixed classes. So every single program in the United States that has heritage language learners, and I would venture to say that it's every program in the United States now has heritage language learners of one type or another, have mixed classes. And yet we don't have a clear methodology on mixed classes. All right, so the main challenge of mixed classes, the reason why we don't really have a methodology is because mixed classes are incredibly diverse. In a way, they shouldn't exist. Because we should have separate classes all the time, but it's not, it can't be done for practical reasons. So mixed classes consist of L2 learners, which up on the screen, I have depicted them as all looking the same ducks. It's not the same. It's not true that they're all the same, but as compared to HL learners and for purposes of language learning, they are the same because they have gone through identical sequences of language acquisition. HL learners, on the other hand, are come in many different forms. So they're not the birds of the same flock or the same feathers. Their background changes a lot. And with changing backgrounds, you get changing proficiency and skills, right? So that's the problem with mixed classes. They are hyper diverse environments. So how do we deal with environments, with language learning that traditionally has been so structured? How do we deal with a hyper-diverse learning environment where it cannot be structured in the same way because every learner needs something different? So I'm going to start with the non-negotiables of mixed classes. And this is the first part, mixed classes. And this is what the non-negotiables are, things that you must absolutely do as an instructor. You must be committed to making sure that both learner types benefit from instructor. And believe it or not, this is not what is actually happening. Olga Kagan and I did another study, and we learned that teachers generally pay attention to one population or the other, typically L2 learners, because they're more comfortable with L2 learners, to the neglect of HL learners or whatever the other population happens to be. So both learners have to get something out of instruction. The second piece is that both learners have to contribute something to instructor. And the third piece is that there has to be student interdependence. So those are the basics of mixed classes. And now let's talk about how to make that happen. Project-based learning is a really good way to do that. And that's where I'm going to go eventually. But before I give you the specifics of project-based learning, I need to go back and talk about mixed classes. And then before I talk about mixed classes, I need to take another step back and talk about differences between HL, heritage language, and L2, second language learners, because that's the foundations of everything for mixed classes. So back to this, I said that HL learners were very different from each other. But since I only have about an hour to do this, I'm going to treat HL learners as a class and L2 learners as a class. It's not enough. You would want to treat the HL learners specifically according to their needs and strengths. But that's another topic. That's differentiated teaching. PBL allows you to do a lot in the way of differentiated teaching, but I don't have time to give you all the additional tools that will enable you to deal with HL learners and L2 learners as individuals. Today, I just want to look at them as classes. Okay, so let's start out with what are some general differences between HL and L2 learners. And I would open this discussion for anybody that's here or for our audience elsewhere. They can put it in the chat. And just what do you think what do you know from experience are some general differences between heritage and second language learners? Yes.
Actual learner tends to know culture more than the L2, and L2 tends to know more about grammar structure than the L. This is really just
Exactly.
Black and white.
Exactly. Explicit grammar. Yeah. Right. Now, are there other differences that you know about? Anybody?
Yeah, often the heritage learners, their oral comprehension and expression is a lot more advanced than their writing skills.
That's right. Right. Okay, so I'm sure everybody has something to say because we've all experienced it, right? So we all know intuitively. But it makes sense for what we're about to do to think about how to organize these differences that casually we tend to throw out. And here I would suggest think in terms of skills, the actual skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So comparing them in terms of each of these skills, the modes of communication, again, actual modes of communication, presentational, which is what I'm doing now, going out to you, interpersonal, which is typically depicted as people talking to each other, this kind of thing, and interpretive, which involves reading and listening. Right? We also want to think in terms of register. We can talk about the academic register, informal registers, dialectal register, functional skills, right? What learners can do with language. And then this difference of how much intuitive versus metalinguistic knowledge they have of grammar, which we know L2 learners are much better with metalinguistic knowledge because they've had a chance to study language formally. So it's a good idea to go to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines and actually very systematically, we're not going to do it here, but very systematically go through each of the points and create a menu that compares HL learners and L2 learners. I'm going to do a mini menu here today to show you how helpful that is. And we can think of each population of learners as having strengths. Now, if you look, for instance, at skills, you see that L2 learners are really strong, I believe you said it, at reading and writing. And then HL learners tend to have the opposite skills, like the mirror skills, which are listening and speaking. And same thing with registers. L2 learners tend to be very good with the academic register, but H2 learners are better with everyday language, etc. You can go down that list. I don't have time to go down that list, but we can see, one thing we can do when we look at this list, is this comparison chart, is say, oh my God, they have absolutely nothing in common. How do I teach these two groups which are opposites of each other, right? In fact, they are mirror images of each other. This is from the I Love Lucy show a long time ago, great episode. All right, so they're mirror images of each other. This actually creates opportunities for learning if you look in terms of something I already mentioned, collaborative learning. right? But typically, we find that teachers adopt this mentality. When we see these differences, we think of learners as being against each other, right? At odds with each other. I have to pay attention to one population or another. There's no way I can deal with both at once because it's the opposites. But where we really want to go is here, where we see learners as helping each other out so that they can move together towards that goal that you have for every learner in your class. So there were two very interesting interactions, studies of paired interactions between heritage and second language learners. They were matched for proficiency. That was part of the study, but I put it down because that does not happen in real life. This is the kind of thing where you read studies that are done in a lab. They're very controlled, and those conditions are hardly ever met. So you have to discard that if you're going to try this, okay? Now, the learners worked on an information gap. For those of you that don't remember what this is, I have a picture, you have a picture, which is very similar, but there's small differences between the two pictures. And then we talk to each other, ask each other questions, and eventually figure out what those differences are. So there were two studies. In the first study, second language learners benefited more from the activity than AHL learners. In the second study, both types of learners benefited equally from the activity. Obviously, we want the second study. We want the results of the second study. So what happened in the first study? The information gap activity was that of a kitchen, which is home vocabulary. Our HL learners, if they know anything, it's that vocabulary, right? And the task that they were supposed to do, they were talking to each other. So everything was oral. That's what our HL learners can do. So guess what happened? The HL learners already knew this, so they did not gain new knowledge. The L2 learners, on the other hand, really benefited from the help that they got from the HL learners. So what we have is suboptimal task design because it fails to meet the non-negotiables. The HL learners are not getting anything out of this. They're acting as teachers. They're their students, right? All right, so let's look at the second study, information gap activity again, but it was an office, not a home environment, so a more neutral environment. And there was an oral and a written task. Vocabulary was unknown to both types of learners, so they both benefited from trying to figure out what to call different things in the picture. There was an oral task, which benefited L2 learners, because remember, that's what they need help with, talking spontaneously. And then there was a written task that benefited the HL learners because that's what they need help with. They need to learn how to write. So the learners work together at both tasks. Now, this meets the non-negotiables. This exemplifies correct task design. We also know from this study that there was a lot of positive student interdependence created, and numerous studies have looked at this over the years. This is one that was done for Arabic. This is a comment that a student made, and notice how empowering and valuable this experience or this approach was. Both have something to bring to the table. This is a comment by a student. Non-heritage students usually ask questions that I would never think of asking, and this helps in my understanding of the grammar of Arabic. So both student populations are progressing and are contributing. So here's a little chart I created. Remember, I said you want to go back to the actual proficiency guidelines, and very systematic. Go through all the points. There are many points in the actual proficiency guidelines. So many that sometimes is very confusing, but it's very helpful. So what are beneficial practices for L2 learners? Well, listening, they really need, that's the weakest part of what they can do, right? They can't control it as well. Speaking, presentational when it's oral, not presentational when it's written, that they can do. Presentational written is something that HL learners need help with, right? Interpersonal, when people are talking to each other, L2 learners in spontaneous settings struggle, right? Whereas with the interpersonal, HL learners struggle, believe it or not, with rehearsed speech because they're not used to editing their language. They have a very organic approach to communication. So when you ask them to write and to edit what they've written, they just either don't know how to do it or don't want to do it. They resist doing it. I'm seeing you guys go like this because you've seen this. L2 learners benefit from implicit use of grammar and vocabulary learning. By implicit, I mean you run across it and at that moment you pick it up. Whereas HL learners benefit from explicit grammar. They should know grammar vocabulary because that is the currency of the classroom. You're going to use terminology, and every time you say noun phrase, you don't want the HL learner pulling out the dictionary and to try to figure out what you're talking about. All right, so let me show you how this works. I'm going to assume you have a writing task. Now, you have a writing task, and I'm going to show you in a minute a good example from a textbook. You ask yourself, okay, it's writing, so it's something that's really going to benefit my HL learners. So what I need to do is add a speaking ability because I need to do something for my L2 learners. Remember, that's part of the non-negotiables, right? So this is a very common activity in textbooks, fill in the blanks or close activities where something is taken out of a sentence and then students have to fill it in. Don't worry about reading the specifics of it, but let's say it's written down and your students are now writing it down together as a group work in the classroom. Well, what you can do is, if the primary focus of the activity is writing, or if the only activity involves writing, you want to add an element of saying it, of speaking oral element. Why? Because in that way, you've got something for both learners. The key, though, is that the HL learner should write it and the L2 learner should say it. And not only that, but the L2 learner should be saying it in a semi-spontaneous way, tapping into implicit grammar. So I have a hunch that this works. Now for writing, the HL learner is going to think about how to do it. And if he doesn't quite know how to write a word, in Spanish this happens a lot, they miss accents, then they stop the activity and they look up the rules of accentuation or spelling, and they go through an explicit activity where they say, no, typically when this happens, you put an accent mark there. So that's explicit grammar and vocabulary learning. So notice that how this chart helps you put something in it and structure an activity that you already have in your textbook. Structure it in a way that both learners get something out of it. So the take-home lesson about mixed classes is that you have to meet the non-negotiables by taking advantage of the complementary strengths of HL and L2 learners. Use that chart, right, to create activities where there's something in it for each one to learn and something that each one can teach the other, right? And then that enables you to create opportunities for collaborative learning. Remember, you must assign the harder task for each learner to that learner. Don't give them the easier task, right? Yes.
Can I clarify? So are you running two parallel activities for the different classes of learners?
They're working together.
Okay.
You want them to work together because that's where collaborative learning happens. That's where each student population is going to say, I learned something from the other and I contributed something to
So
the
they're
class.
all doing both.
They're both doing both. Absolutely. And they're helping each other. Okay, so now that we've looked at our HL learners, mixed classes, now we're ready for the star of this show, PBL. And I love PBL. Here's a very quick definition. It's a learner-centered teaching approach. So learner-centered, not grammar-centered, in which students work over a period of time. It's not a task, right? I know part of a series is going to do task-based learning. A task takes place in a classroom setting, in one classroom typically. PBL takes place over a period of time. I keep my PBL projects going over an entire semester. And why is that? Because it engages learners in solving very complex problems and addressing real life challenges. And real life challenges are never that easy, right? They're not solved in a 1 hour class, right? And then to communicate what they've done, to communicate how they've solved the problem, they develop a product. So these are the elements of project-based learning. And now I'm going to go through them. I'm taking my time. Now, first, I'm going to start with a sample project. And this is from real life, and it happened during the pandemic. It came from an Actful Smart Brief. These are little newsletters that they send. And this was featured in a newspaper. And what happened, what the story is about, is that there were two children in a family that felt very intimidated, of course, by the pandemic, very scared. And also, they kind of rebelled against the mask because they felt like they were constantly hidden against that mask, right? So they worked with mom to create a bilingual book. It's called Behind My Mask, Detrás de mi cubrebocas. I call it Máscara. And then they created a real book, which at the time I went to Amazon and you could buy it. That is a real product, right? That's what a real project is. Okay, so notice it's learner-centered. This is what the students needed to do at that time to deal with all the anxieties. It takes place over a prolonged period of time. Writing a book is never something that happens from one day to the next or in one class period. It involves looking into complex issues to solve problems and to address real-life challenges. And then the way you communicate your learning is not with a test, but it's by creating a product that actually addresses the issue that you were interested in addressing. Now, good projects, when done really well, they look spontaneous and you, wow, that's wonderful, but they do not happen spontaneously. Just the opposite. There are many challenges that you have to meet along the way, but they're very doable, right? As long as you know that they're there, you can anticipate that they're there. Okay, so the first one is that you have to follow a set of steps. And I'm going to give you those steps and give you examples of model how to meet those steps. And then there are other ones about, I hear from teachers all the time, oh, I can't make PBL work in my class. You see, I'm in a regular language class and nobody's gonna let me do PBL. I have a little solution for that. Another thing I frequently hear is PBL works really well for advanced learners, but it'll never work for lower proficiency learners. You can't do it. Not true, and I'm going to demonstrate it very clearly. And finally, another common question is, how do you assess projects? And even that's easy. It looks hard, but it's actually surprisingly easy. So let's go to how to design and structure the project. You first decide on a theme, and we're going to go through that. Then there's a problem. We're going to go through that. You determine the final outcome, which is the product. And then you follow these three steps: information gathering or collecting, information processing, and information presenting or reporting. So let's get to it. The theme. Well, what is the theme? A theme is the topic of your project, what the project is about. I'm going to show you a couple of projects related that my students worked on related to professions or careers. Now, my students were college students, so it makes sense that this would be a topic of interest. But even if you teach young learners want to think about what they want to be when they grow up. So this is a very flexible thing that applies at many levels. So let's talk. I already gave you an example of a theme. I want to hear from you other themes that you think might work well for a project.
Food.
Food, it's everybody's favorite theme. Yes, actually, that's the number one theme we hear. I wonder why. Any other themes you can think of? I don't want to put anybody in this. What?
Housing?
Oh, for college students. Yes.
Or LA residents?
Oh, that's right. That's right. That did not occur to me, but that's right. That's a very important topic that learners can actually help with.
Real life, right?
Yeah, very real life. So is food, by the way. Okay, so here's some other ones I put down: family, health, traditions, celebrations, travel, food, and organizing events. The last of these I had actually, separate. Oh no, I put it separately. You can see that it's animated because it's not something that's found in books typically, but it makes for a very good project. All right, notice, by the way, if you want to craft a theme, think in terms of a noun or a noun phrase, not a sentence. And I find that's really important because when I'll say themes, people will give me something that's a full sentence, and then I'll say, no, that's a problem. A problem is stated in a full sentence. Your theme is just a label, which is stated in a noun phrase. So that helps a lot. And why do we want to start with a theme? Because it's kind of like the broadest statement, and it helps you orient yourself about what might be a problem of interest. So, for instance, if you start with a theme of family, it's very easy to find problems, right? So and everybody's interested in finding problems related to family situations. Chores. My daughter's sitting here next to me. All right. Starting with a theme also helps you identify the vocabulary that students will need to master in order to address the problem. So when I hear family chores, maybe I start to think, okay, my daughter needs to do that, my son needs to go to the store, whatever. So you start generating vocabulary right away, and maybe even grammar forms, right? So this relates to the second challenge, and which involves how do we make this work if you're in a regular classroom and you've got the syllabus, and week 1 you got to do unit 1, and week 3 you move to unit 2, and you've got all this vocabulary in each unit. What do you do? How do you bring in PBL? And let me just show you how I do it, and it works quite well. I look at my textbook. What are some common themes in textbooks? We just mentioned them, right? There's always a chapter about food, always a chapter about travel, always a chapter maybe about family, right? So I make my list of, there's always a chapter about sports. So I have my list now because I've looked at the units or chapters in the textbook. Now, my next point is, okay, I've got these in the book already, so it might be good to make a project out of them, but how do I use this in a mixed class such that it's good for HL and L2 learners? And here's one strategy. Use them to compare and contrast cultural practices, perspectives, and products of the US and the target culture. If you're familiar with ACTFL, you know that this wording of cultural practices, perspectives, and products comes from ACTFL. So sports. What is the most popular sport in Spain? Soccer, I would say, right? That's definitely not the most popular sport in the United States, right? What about in China? What's the most popular sport? Well, whatever, right? But notice that you're teaching a Spanish class, and there's somebody who comes from the Spanish-speaking world and thinks from Argentina, thinks soccer is the best sport in the world. Somebody else comes from Cuba and thinks baseball is the best sport in the world. Somebody else comes from the United States and say, no, there's nothing like basketball. I think that's the most popular sport right now. You can start to compare and contrast. Right? Same thing with food, with family life, with life and career goals. A lot of times our heritage language students come from homes where the parents have very rigid ideas about what they have to do in the future. Or you have to become a doctor or whatever. And so it makes for very interesting comparisons and a lot of learning about little C culture, right? So that's the idea. You want to go through the book and try to connect your themes for PBL to your book, because once you do this, then your textbook is doing double duty, and you can eliminate a little bit the problems associated with being teaching a traditional class when PBL is not traditional. Okay, so now we've done making sort of PBL work in a regular class. Let me go back to designing and implementing projects. We've done themes. Let's do the problem. The problem is a real life issue. And the problems can come from many places, from the real world, the school setting, like the school menu, the cafeteria menu, what if you don't like it? Or the home environment, as I said, a family issue that's not sensitive and can be talked about. Now, when we teach foreign languages, we do the opposite of a real issue. I don't have time to read this quote, but the first part of it, the non-underlined part, says, what do we typically do in a classroom? At the end of a semester, we ask our students to create something. They turn it in. No other students read it. It has no practical value for the real world. And sometimes I have to confess, a professor doesn't even read it very carefully because you don't have time. It's a waste of effort, energy, etc. Notice that in a classroom, in a traditional classroom, there's no public audience for the student work because it's not real. There's no public out there that cares about this. Nobody actually uses what is created. Who needs a paper on the Enlightenment? And they do not, you probably like the Enlightenment, but I mean, most teenagers or young people don't need to take home a paper on the Enlightenment, right? It's not what people do in the real world. Although there are ways of, I don't have time, but I once created a project around the ideas of the Enlightenment. Don't have time for this. We can talk about it if at the end we have some time. But now, so we want to have real world authenticity. We want to have a real audience that can benefit from this, a real problem that matters to somebody other than an academic who's interested in the Enlightenment. Okay, so now you think, okay, so we got to make it real, but doesn't this make it too hard for beginning learners, right? Real requires a lot of language and a lot of cognitive work. This is out of the reach of beginning learners. And that brings me to the third challenge. How do we create real life projects for the lower levels of proficiency? Now, the point I want to make with a few examples I'm going to give you is that real life problems can be solved at very low levels of proficiency, believe it or not. And I'm going to use the red, I'm going to show you with using the red pieces as examples of projects that actually can be solved with very low levels of proficiency. And then I'm going to turn to the black to show you a trick for if you have a project and you can't think of how to make it real, using those two as problem or embedding whatever you're doing into either of those two options, how you can make it authentic. But hold on that. Let's go to the red. Okay, so proposing a schedule of chores at home. These are the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. You can see that the novice level, which is the very beginning, they can only use formulaic language you give them. And they can only use words and phrases. Typically, they want to talk about themselves at this level. And the really key feature of the novice level is that learners do not create with language. They just use stuff that's given to them. Okay, so you got your book and you're on the chapter about family. And you want to solve a real family problem, the scheduling of chores. And they're going to create a schedule of chores. By the way, you've already done Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, days of the week, and you might have done the times, or if you haven't, this is a good time to introduce the time. What level do you think a scheduling of chores is at?
List.
Well, it's really at the novice level, right? There are no sentences. There's no creating anything. You just go to a dictionary or you go to the listing of vocabulary in your chapter on family and you take the words and you put them there. Okay? Very simple. There's no sentence and there's no creating with language, right? Washing dishes. That is already kind of a preformed phrase, right? Now let's look at creating healthy, easy recipes from the heritage culture. This looks a little harder, so maybe it's reasonable to think that it's at the intermediate level because the intermediate level now involves creating with language, and it's no longer words, loose words, but connected sentences, loosely connected. Yeah, and you could say it's at the intermediate level, but what if you have already a recipe in your target language, right? And I'm saying, okay, what are the ingredients that you can't find here in the United States that are in that recipe? Now let's substitute ingredients that you cannot find here in the United States, or you would have to drive a long distance to find. Let's find substitutes that are easy to find here. Notice you're at the novice level now, right? Very easy to just take a word out and substitute it with another word. There you're using other people's words, and I'm going to talk about this very soon. So there's this perception that if you're doing something hard that's engaging, that makes you think, it's not possible to do it at the lower proficiency level. But as I hope you're starting to see now, is that this perception is wrong. Let me give you another example that I think is a very good example of this, probably the most convincing example if you're not convinced yet. So if I ask you to list 4 adjectives that describe, let's say you're in a job interview, and this is a real question that comes up in the job interview. I say to you, give me 4 adjectives that describe you. Pick 2 that are strengths and 2 that could be considered flaws. This is very hard. I dare you to answer this question spontaneously like that. If you go into a job interview, you better be prepared to answer something like this. It's so 2 questions. How linguistically challenging is it? And how cognitively challenging is it? Okay, so what's my point? I'm going to show you that we can engage students in complex and authentic activities, cognitively complex and authentic activities with relatively simple language. So let's say I ask you, give me 2 positive adjectives. Well, we could generate a list of adjectives in the target language. You would, in my class, this would be done in Spanish, right? And then you could pick from there, those which describe you or those which you think are best suited to the job, right? That was easy, linguistically and probably cognitively too. But now, oh, and notice, by the way, that this is all at the novice level. Very easy. Real, challenging, easy. What about flaws? That's the other part of the question. Give me 2 flaws. That's much harder, right? You can generate a list, but you probably don't want to utter the sentence, I am abrasive, or I'm jealous, or obnoxious. And that's not the way to go. And we do this in my class, and students go, oh yeah, that's right. You can't do that. So then we have to come up for how to deal with the negatives. And we've talked a lot about these things, and we eventually come up with what are called sentence frames. I want to be more. I'm working on being more, which suggests that you're not as observant or mindful or organized as you could be, but you're framing it in a very positive way. Or you could say, I want to be less shy, and you're smart about what you're picking, opinionated, impatient, pessimistic, anxious. You don't want to say, I want to be less deceitful. Right? So notice this requires a lot of cognitive ability and strategizing, right? So while it's at the novice level, it's at the novice level because I give them the sentence frame and they have the adjectives. It's at the novice level linguistically. At the cognitive level, it is extremely challenged. Try this with your students. You will see it will take an entire class time to come to a consensus about how to do this. So this is an engaging project that's authentic and that can be done at very low proficiency levels. Typically, low proficiency level exercises are really dull, right? Okay, so bottom line I'm getting at with this is that we can engage students in cognitively complex tasks with very limited language. And when we do that, we end up with engagement. Students are interested in authenticity, real world problem. All right, this brings us to product. We're getting there, product. The product is how students solve the real world problem, how they communicate their learning, right? So these are products because if the real world problem is answering the question, oh, what are good qualities? And you answer this way, these are the products that solve the problem, okay? But there are many other products, and here are a few of them. Survey, menu, greeting cards, marketing campaign. You know what? And I dare you to go through your textbook and look at what kind of products students are engaged in creating in a typical textbook. You won't find half of these. Textbooks are very limited in terms of the products that they ask students to produce, to create. And the products typically have no relationship to what people actually produce in real life. Right? All right, so I'm going to use poster to make my next point, which is that most products do not have a fixed level of proficiency. Now, I see that certain of you guys are going, yeah, it makes sense. But a lot of times when I teach this, people think of a survey only has one level of proficiency. A menu only has one level of proficiency. But if you actually collect menus, you'll find that there are menus that are very simple and just have pictures and then a couple of words. Menus that are like poems where they tell you what's going to be there and extremely rare wording and you name it, right? So, and this is the case for everything, right? So that's very good. Because let's say we want to talk about careers, we can find posters like this in real life. This is hard to see, I apologize, but it says it lists nouns and adjectives that are associated with the phrase, I am a nurse. Commitment, empathetic, discipline, compassionate. Notice again here we're at the actual novice level. Loose words, right? No creating. We're not making up these words exist. But notice this is also a career-based poster. And now we have questions, and I'm going to have to put my glasses on. So upper right hand, left hand says, ask yourself, what are my interests? Then moving to the right says, which subjects do I like? Right? There are also commands. So one of those says compare different careers. That's a command. Find out about employers. Let's see, get inspired by people. So we have questions and commands. Those are typically associated with the actual intermediate level. And intermediate, mid to high. Now, let me make a point here. If your students are at the intermediate mid-level, you don't want them to create this. You don't want them to create something that's at the level they are at. You want them to create something that's a sub-level higher, right? It's like if you exercise at the same level every day, you don't progress. You have to keep upping the ante in order to develop your muscles. And it's the same thing. When I'm talking about creating a poster for the novice level, I'm saying students that are at the novice, they have to be at the novice low level in order to create a poster for the novice level. If you want a poster at the intermediate level, give it to a novice, maybe not novice low, but novice mid, and bump them up by working on it to the next level up. Never have them do something that they can do on their own. That's called proficiency. If they have the proficiency, they can do it on their own. They don't need you. You want them to do something that is a performance. Performance is what they can do with your help. Okay, now this is a poster that my students created. And this poster is at the actual intermediate mid to high level. It was part of a project-based class I taught, and very quickly I'm going to explain what it was about. It's a class for students who want to use Spanish in a professional setting. So it's not a class for majors, it's for teachers, journalists that want to use Spanish as journalists, health professionals, any other number of jobs that are done in Spanish, which is just about everything, right? And but becoming a secondary teacher, as my daughter who's here and is in the process of doing that, is a very complicated task. There are many steps that you have to follow in order. So my students in that class were interested in becoming teachers. I had students in that class who wanted to be health professionals, other students who wanted to be business professional. Each student created, or each group of students created something according to their interest, learner-centered, remember PBL? So my students who wanted to be teachers said, you know, this is a real problem that needs to be fixed. Everybody's really confused about these steps. They went and they talked to the woman that's listed way at the bottom, Cynthia Leathers, who's the credentialing advisor at the school where I taught before retiring. And she said, you know, students get to me and they're at the 4th level where they have the practicum and they've forgotten to do something at level 1. And it creates huge problems. Okay, so the students thought that's a real life problem in need of fixing. Okay. And so they created this poster. One of the things they had to learn how to do was Photoshop. They said to me, we don't know how to do Photoshop. I said, well, tough, you got to learn it because that's how you're going to solve the problem. So they learned it. Notice how useful that is. And then another thing is they had to create this poster and it had to be displayed because they agreed with Cynthia Leathers to display this poster by her office. So students walking by her office or waiting to see her for advising could see these steps. So it couldn't be a little poster like that. It had to be a big poster. So they said to me, what do we do? I don't figure it out. So they went to Costco and they realized they could get this poster printed, which is huge and beautiful, for something like $25 at the time. So that was their final product. How is that for solving a real world problem. So notice now that we have sort of come up with strategies, and there's an order of operations to these strategies. First of all, the most important thing is select products that address the problem, the real world issue. Don't start out thinking, oh, what's an easy product that my students can create? No, the focus is always on the real world issue. And now we have the advantage of knowing that basically any product can be done at different levels of proficiency. So once you decide that for a project based on careers and professions, a poster is the best product, then you can look into, well, what kind of poster do I want? Do I want something with just words for my beginning learners? Or do I want something as sophisticated as the one on the right? My learners were seniors when they created that, right? But what drives you is the world, the real world. What product will solve the problem? Here's another similar strategy for lower students at lower proficiency levels, keeping the same theme, careers. You can think of an event. Remember I said an event is a really good way to create authenticity. So let's say you organize, because you want to make your language learning useful. You think, I'm going to organize an event, a jobs fair at school. And it's a theme is careers, and the problem is organizing a jobs fair. Now you got to think of the product. And here's what you can think of. You can say, do my learners actually need to make a product or select a product? So making a product is this. And notice here I have two lists of verbs. The ones on the right all involve creating with language, right? But maybe my learners are not ready to create with language because they're not at the intermediate level. Well, I can have them engage in the kinds of activities associated with the verbs on the left. And these activities involve using other people's language. They are what's called input-oriented projects. So for a job fair, I might choose something like this, right? And many other posters. Notice the learners didn't create these posters. They look for them, but they're now posting them. This would be in the target language as part of the job fair. Now, well, here's another example. Remember I said I was going to do gifting? And this is a serious problem with my husband, who was here a second ago. When his birthday comes around, I don't know what to give him because he doesn't want clothes. He's a professor of computer science. I can't give him anything related to computer science. So I took to giving him poems. Okay, I would go online and find beautiful poems and then framing them. Okay, and he kind of liked that, you know. So it occurred to me that collections are great ways of solving the gifting problem for people that are difficult to gift to, right? So what I'm calling a curated collection, where students go online and they find excellent ones. In my case, for my husband, the poems were love poems because it was for his birthday and they were from me, right? So you might say to yourself, yeah, they're not creating anything. How are they learning? They're learning because they're spending a lot of time online looking for very focused materials that are contextualized, that are not just anything. You're looking for, in the case of my curated collection of poems, I'm looking for love poems. So in that context, I'm searching and finding love poems that use the language, all the language associated with love poems, right? And they're authentic input. So this is a wonderful opportunity to get what you need, the kind of input that we know promotes language learning. So again, notice this can happen at a very low level. So let me do a quick recap. You want to be strategic when you're selecting your product. First of all, you want to think what products are going to address the problem, not what products can my students do? And then use adaptive strategies. Think about if you're going to do a poster, well, what kind of poster? Is it going to be with loose words, phrases, entire sentences? And then remember that you have this choice of asking your students to create something or to select something, or you can do it halfway, select something and then create something within that. So I talked about this with the recipe. You have a recipe in front of you, now you're going to change it up. to make it doable in the country, in the United States, right? So that's a halfway point there. So now let's come to project-based learning for mixed classes, and you already know what to do. Remember this quick guide that I created. Your product, you want to have at least 2 products, never one product, because if you have only one product, you are helping only one type of learner. You're not helping both types of learners, so you're not meeting the non-negotiables. So let's look at an example of that. Let's say we're going to have a career fair at school, and we do what I have suggested up to now, having posters. Okay, so then I say to myself, that involves, it's a presentational mode and it involves writing. So who benefits from being challenged to write something? Heritage language learners, right? If I stop at that, I have not met the non-negotiables. Now I need to, so I need to now go back and say, what can I add? And this little sheet helps me a lot. So, okay, there's a writing piece. So, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to think about how to introduce a speaking piece, because that's what my L2 learners learn. But I have to be sophisticated about this, because it's in the context of a career fair. It's got to be real, not an excuse to speak. So how about if your L2 learners are in booths answering questions from students who circulate about careers in different fields. Now they're working spontaneously and they're speaking and they're using all the vocabulary that they learned or practiced to create the poster. Remember, everybody's involved in creating both products, but at the end, you're assigning these products to the people for whom it's a greater challenge. They work together to get it done perfectly, and then you separate them when it's time to give the final presentation, or the final product. So notice what we have achieved. Authenticity. So real products for a job fair. There's always a booth in a jobs fair, and there's always kind of pamphlets or posters, and we've met the non-negotiables, right? So this brings us to the last bit, which is how do we structure the project? So we have information gathering. This is where students get input. It could be written, it could be that they listen to it. Information processing, where they connect form and meaning. And we know that's essential for learning a language, right? I can sit in front of the TV hearing Russian all day long and I won't learn anything. Learning comes when you connect. That's what I'm hearing. That's what it means, right? And then there's information presenting, which is the output part. Now I'm going to do something with what I have learned. Okay, so let's look at that. Again, I'm going to use my careers theme, but this is from the same class, another year I taught it. I still use the careers theme because that's what the class was about. And the problem was kind of similar, preparing for the Spanish language job market, but I changed up the products. My students had to create a resume, a cover letter, a video CV. It turns out that that's the way to go. Young people create video CVs where they highlight their accomplishments. And then we were going to do, and we also did a mock job interviews. This is a project that took the entire semester to do. I'm going to go through it very, very quickly. First step of how to structure the project is you spend a considerable amount of time gathering or collecting information. That's where you get the input. Okay, so students work in groups and they create a center, an online repository of materials where they create anything that they're going to have to look at in the target language to create all these products. Okay? Now, when we typically start doing this, the first thing students put in this repository, because they don't know how to do this, is articles on advice on how to prepare a CV, a cover letter, a video, and an interview. And at that point, when I see this, I go, yep. I don't say it to them, but I said, yep, I wanted you to make this mistake. Because after they do that, I said, okay, create a CV. And all they have is the advice. They can't create a CV. That's when they realize, in order to create a CV, a resume, a cover letter, a video, an interview, I need to look at what other people have created. And I sort of need to appropriate the use of language, the format, the organization. So now I said, okay, work in groups and create a repository of authentic CVs, cover letters. And I encourage them at first to not be all that smart about what they collect, to put everything in there. Because part of what we do in class, I'll say to them, okay, now you have 5 CVs. What's the best one? What's the worst one? And then we get into an argument with why is good and one is bad. And it's very useful. You know why? Because all of a sudden they start to deconstruct the activity and understand what it takes to have a good CV. It's not just listing of things. There's a strategy and an organization behind it, right? Now, even this is not, they find. Why is that? Because I remember one semester I had a student who was a computer science major, and he raised his hand and he said, I don't know how to say data structures in Spanish. And I said, well, if you don't know, I don't know either, imagine me. But we can figure this out. And we started talking, the class, we all got together and I said, we're trying to find how to say something, somebody's dictionary, and that didn't work out so well. And then somebody came up with this idea of, well, look at job announcements and articles in Spanish, and then web page of course descriptions for different university departments. So we went to the University of UNAM in Mexico City, and we went to the computer science department, and lo and behold, there was a course on data structures. And then you could get out all the verbs associated with data structures, everything. Notice what a rich activity that is for learning vocabulary. How contextualized it is. Why all of this? Because they need all of it. They need to learn vocabulary, but it's not just vocabulary. They have to practice with genre-specific features. In a CV, you never put an entire sentence. You put chunks of phrases, right? You want to learn how to organize things. If you're a student and you have no experience, we go through this in the class. Do you want to start out with your weakest point that you have absolutely no experience? No. You want to put that near the bottom, right? On the other hand, if you're an experienced CEO, wow, your experience goes on top. So notice this becomes about a lot more than language. This becomes about strategizing, and it gives them really valuable life skills, right? Who gathers all this information, the information collecting? What do you think, the teacher or the students? The student, right? But the teacher can't be absent. The teacher is there sort of behind the scenes saying, oh, did you consider this or that? And then leading the students, because the students don't really know how to learn, right? Notice, remember, they start out thinking that if they get articles on how to write a CV, they can stop there. They don't really know, okay? So that brings us to the information processing piece. This is really important for what is called negotiating meaning, which we know is essential to language learning. I don't just get information, but now I try to communicate with you, and in communicating with you, maybe you go, I didn't quite understand that, and now I have to rephrase it, and then maybe you say, oh, the word is this, and then I learned that word, right? And so negotiating is very important. So how does this happen? Well, just to give you an example, using the CV and cover letter, I allow a lot of time for this because this is where a lot of language learning takes place, by the way. So I'll say, hey, what kind of vocabulary are you seeing in these CVs? And we make a list on the board. What kind of grammatical constructions? In Spanish, when you're describing something that you've done, you typically use nouns. In English, you use past participles, worked on, created, managed, redesigned, right? So right away they notice, oh, I'm not going to use a past participle when I'm writing a Spanish CV. I'm going to use nouns. Design of, management of, right? So we notice vocabulary, grammatical constructions. We compare different models of the same product to figure out what makes a good product and a not so good, right? And we analyze the forms and functions. How do you express a command? In Spanish, with things you hang up formally in a public setting, you use the infinitive usually to give a command, which is a different form than you would use when you're speaking to people directly, right? We study the conventions of each genre. As I said, in a CV, you never want to have long sentences. You have phrases, right? And then you put this all together. And one day in class, I say, hey, let's create a rubric. And this is the rubric I'm going to use to grade your work. And it's a rubric that you're going to use to perfect your work before you turn it in. This is very useful because they're creating it based on what they've seen works, right? So notice how rich the experience becomes. Again, who does all of this? Students, right? But who's behind all of this? The teacher. You cannot abandon your students to do this. You're several steps ahead of them. You're anticipating mistakes and in some cases, prompting them to make mistakes because that's the way they're going to learn. All right, and that brings us to the last step, structuring the project. And this is where you report or present your project. Now think about it. In a traditional class, what happens is, end of a semester, turn in your final paper. Teachers sometimes are so pressed to kind of look at it really quickly and give it a grade. Students never get it back. Nobody ever learns from this experience, right? That's not what happens in project-based learning. What happens in project-based learning is that we create these little products a step at a time. So I break up the information presenting into sub-pieces. And in each class, we work on a sub-piece. And I'll give you an example in a second. At the end of that class period, students turn in that little piece that they worked on. And I'll give you examples of what a little piece looks like. And then they get a grade. It's low stakes assessment. Basically, I grade them on whether they were on task. I'm not looking for perfection by any means, right? Then I take these little cards home. They call them exit cards. And I look at them and I say, oh my God, they did not get that in Spanish you use nouns and not past participles in a CD. I better go back the next day and explain that. So now I go back and I say, hey guys, this is something we need to work on, right? And so now, and I added their particular little cards. It's very easy to do, by the way, because the card just is like this, and I'm grading everybody's very quickly. Then as we pile on these little cards with information, eventually you put them all together and you've got all the pieces of your final product. And they create that final product, that poster that you saw before from my class, for example. And now I use the real world standard to evaluate it. And you go, wow, that's very high standards. And yeah, you know why? Because we have been working piece by piece by piece, and every single time they created something, they've gotten feedback, and they've had the opportunity to edit it. So at the end, they're going to pull it all together, right? At that point, they can create a perfect product. So here's what I do. Every day, I walk into the class, and I say, okay, you've got your center with a whole bunch of CDs. I want you to make a list of 10 section labels. Labels are going to be things like education, experience, references, special skills, whatever. And maybe 3 common verbs that you find. And they put it on the exit card. That might be one activity. They're familiarizing themselves there with the language. I might then send them home and say, now write section labels for your own CD. Okay, that's an individual card they have to create. Then after that, I might say, under each label, find what you want to list. This is where my students say, I don't know how to say data structures in Spanish. And that's where we then go back and say, well, let's find out how to say data structures in Spanish. And then I keep building on the assignments. And then I say, finally, turn in your first draft of the CD, and they get feedback, right? For the cover letter, we do the same thing. What's the salutation? How does the cover letter move from one paragraph to another? How do we sign off? How do we say, I hope to hear from you again? And then there's this assignment that we do early on, because it's a wonderful assignment. It's based on something President John F. Kennedy said. Every man is a great sentence. What's your sentence? So I asked them to come up with one sentence that defines them. And then they realize this CV, this cover letter, this video, everything has to go back to that, has to advance that idea of this is what I'm about, this is what I bring to the job. Notice how strategic they are becoming. Exit cards support teaching, right? Because I look over them every single time, I underline problems, and then I return them to students. In some cases, I meet with them in small groups and say, no, look, you've got this piece wrong. Let's work on how to do this. Other times they're okay, and I let them keep going. The final product that emerges from the sum of the work done in class, which is a collection of the exit cards, the edits, everything. So you're pulling it all together to create that final product. So you see, it's a continuous cycle. You collect information, you look at the information, you say, what can I extract from it? You present little bits of it, you get feedback from me, then you fix it, you edit, and then maybe you say, in order to get to the next point, I got to collect new information. And the cycle starts all over again. It's a very rich learning cycle, right? Back to the challenges, the very last one. And assessment is so easy in project-based learning. It doesn't look like it would be, but it's really much easier than writing a test. Why is that? Remember, every step is assessed using exit cards. Low stakes assessment, but they add up, right? If you have 15 classes and they're getting graded at each of these 15 classes, eventually, if you mess up enough, that'll bring down your grade. All right? Students receive feedback at every single step and edit their work in small increments. They can sometimes do it individually, in groups, or collectively in class, right? But the point is, we don't just make something and put it away. We make something and we're constantly revising it, right? And then the final product is very high quality. It's evaluated by real world standards. It's high stakes and they know it, but it's high stakes because they can do it at that point. They can do a very good product because they've had a lot of scaffolding. So notice what we find that with project-based learning, that the interconnectedness of project work, instruction, and assessment is just really nicely, smoothly integrated, which is an ideal that you want for instruction. So recapping by way of summary. Theme and driving question, select those for real-world relevance and engagement, and coordinate with your textbook or syllabus if you press to cover your textbook, which so many people are. It's a reality. The products, select products first and foremost that solve the driving question and adjust for level using the two different strategies that we looked at. And in mixed classes, when you're doing a project for mixed classes, make sure you have two products, one to benefit each learner. And then in terms of the stages of working with information, structure the process so that everybody gets to collect authentic materials, study them, copy them, and then so that they get a lot of feedback from you, an opportunity to edit so that they can create high quality work. This takes a long time, and you might say, oh, I can't do this, I don't have time. This is the richest kind of learning that you can do, right? And then recapping for mixed classes, which is where we started, you want both learners to benefit from instruction. In a project in a study that Olga Kagan and I did, we interviewed teachers, many of them said, no, we can't deal with HL learners in a classroom. They're there, but they're a small group, and we just have them go along and we pay no attention to what they need because we can't. That's not acceptable. Both learners have to benefit from instruction. They're all paying for the same class, right? Both learners have to contribute, and there's positive student interdependence. They're helping each other. And then to do this, take advantage of complementary strengths and needs, and support collaborative learning, create opportunities for collaborative learning. And use this quick guide. You can amplify it by going to the ACFL proficiency. You can expand it by going to the ACFL proficiency guidelines, but you're welcome to use it, and you're welcome to use this presentation. I will make it available to anybody that has it, maybe through USC, and most of them will have fun. PBL is a lot of fun. Honestly, you end up learning so much stuff. And thank you. And then please write to me anything, any questions that you might have or ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Any time for questions? 5 minutes.
Maybe 5 minutes.
5
if
minutes.
there's
Okay,
anyone.
yeah, I'll take
5 minutes,
questions, yeah.
Are there any in the chat?
No, everybody's.
Oh, you have a question, great.
Sure, yeah.
Good question. So, well, first of all, thank you for coming.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you.
So I'm wondering, so, during the stage of defining the theme and problem, is there only one thing for one class and for the whole semester, or there are different things that students can choose from?
So you asked me one theme or two?
More things or only one thing for the whole class?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's complicated. Now, if I'm understanding, I used to teach project-based learning. And first, you want them to make mistakes, the students to make mistakes. So I would let them go off and I would say, okay, disaster preparedness. I used to do this with disaster preparedness. And then I would say, create a project for disaster preparedness. And everybody would do earthquakes, for example. And they would all come up and I would say, and show them to me and present them. And then I would say, okay, so you did earthquakes, you did earthquakes, you did earthquakes, you did earthquakes. Why the heck do I want to listen to all of you repeating the same thing? So you have this theme, let's say disaster preparedness. Maybe you can do earthquakes. You can do mudslides, LA. You can do, I don't know what, hurricanes now, tropical storms, right? The point is there's a common theme, but you don't want everybody replicating everybody else's work because then there's no need to listen to each other. And also you eliminate really good possibilities to learn from each other. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. So I have a follow-up question on this.
Yeah.
So if there is a big thing, and if every group has a small similar things, do they for the final product or during the process, do they have the learn absolutely within the group? But at the end, when they're presenting the final product, do they learn from each group? Or?
Okay, so you can do project-based in lots of different ways, but be careful. Don't do what I did one year, which I thought I was going to die, when everybody was doing something different. That doesn't work. I had a class with 40 students, and they were in groups of 5, but still 8 projects that are going on at the same time. Even now, I followed all the steps. So they were going to collect information. But, if you're collecting information for a poster and you're collecting information for a pamphlet and you're collecting information for something else, or job fair, I can't be in all those places at once, right? So maybe what you want to do is with the job fairs theme, let's say you all decide you're going to have this poster as one of the products. Then my students who are interested in healthcare are going to create a poster for healthcare. My students who are interested in teaching are going to create a poster for teaching. Yeah, because unless you have a very small class and you can get around, management becomes a problem. And then a really important thing you need to do is we're all going through the same steps at the same time. Today, you're bringing in samples of the product. The samples are going to be different. Obviously, a CV that an engineer is going to create is going to be very different from a CV that dancers are going to create, right? And I've had both in my class. But we're all collecting, and then we're all looking at what we collected, and then we're all copying pieces of what we have collected. We did a very interesting project during the pandemic. We looked at how different parts of LA, or business and some restaurants, teaching, the teachers did teaching, business people who were interested in business did restaurants, people who were interested in health did clinics, and they documented what was happening in each of those fields. It was fabulous what they came up with, and a really good record, a historical record of the pandemic in Long Beach. And notice that's all kind of uniform, right? Everybody's doing something slightly different, the clinics versus restaurants, but they're all following the same recipe, right? I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, I'm fine. So I'm just, concerning about our time, but I think, we we do have a lot of questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and as Dr. Carreira says that, you know, everybody can email her if you have questions and further questions, and you will provide the PPT for us, right? So we will
Okay.
look at them. Yeah.
So you know what I will do? I will get you this very, very detailed chapter